All right, I'm delighted to be part of this conference. I think the organizers did a great job of choosing a topic which is pretty focused, but also one in which there's a lot of interest. So all the papers have been very complimentary. I've learned a lot from some of the other papers and how they relate to my paper, and I think you'll see maybe my paper is one piece of the broader puzzle that we're all looking at this conference. So I'm excited to discuss it. Okay, and this is joint work with Sandeep Mazumdar of Wake Forest University. And the basic question we're addressing is, again, similar to what many of the papers in the conference are addressing, which is the puzzling behavior of inflation over the last 10 years or so, and even earlier than that. And our theme is going to be that one way to make the behavior of inflation somewhat less puzzling and to make the Phillips curve seem a little bit more healthy than it otherwise would is to carefully measure the core level of inflation, and in particular to use the weighted median of price changes across industries as a measure of core inflation. Using that measure of core inflation makes our lives as monetary economists a little bit easier because it filters out some of the transitory noise in inflation that otherwise confuses us. So that will be the argument I make. Okay, again, this paper fits in very well. I think somebody else had a slide where the first line was almost exactly, I mean, I could be sued for plagiarism, except I promise I did this independently. There's been a missing deflation followed by a missing rise in inflation. I don't know how much time I'll have to talk about this. The paper actually dwells not only on inflation over a number of years, but also has a case study on just the last couple of years, 2017, 2018, which were especially puzzling to the Federal Reserve and people who follow U.S. inflation very closely. At the beginning of 2017, the Federal Reserve's favorite measure of core inflation, namely the personal consumption expenditure deflator, excluding food and energy over 12 months, that was at 1.9%. So people were getting excited. We're getting pretty darn close to our target of 2%, and the economy's recovering. And as the economy continued to recover, the core PCE drifted down all the way to 1.3% in September, at which point, this is a Janet Yellen quote, imagine a head of a central bank saying she doesn't fully understand every monthly move in inflation. Must be incompetent. That's a joke. But there was a lot of, in the US, people thought that inflation was especially hard to understand as it drifted down in 2017. At the same time, the economy was recovering. Now, again, this paper is motivated, and probably I'll spend most of my time on this, by the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is dead, the Phillips curve is broken, that's what prominent people say. Alan Blinder has a relatively hopeful interpretation of, well, it's, maybe it's been working hard for a long time, since the 1950s. Maybe it's just gone on vacation, but it'll come back sometime. So there are different ways of expressing the problems with the Phillips curve. Now, in the U.S. literature, one thing I'm struck by is how often people talking about the puzzling behavior of inflation focus on headline inflation measures, either the headline CPI or the headline PCE. It's been known since the 1970s that those series are very volatile. Actually, traditionally, people have said because of food and energy prices. I think Mark Watson was right in pointing out that actually food prices have become relatively stable, but energy prices still month to month or quarter to quarter create a lot of volatility. I think actually if you want to make the point that we do not understand inflation, then it's a smart idea to look at headline inflation, because you'll see all sorts of crazy volatility caused by energy prices. Conversely, if you want to try to actually explain inflation, the first thing you should do is look at some measure of core inflation, not headline inflation. Now, many people do that, but in the US, by far the most common measure of core inflation is the traditional one from the 1970s of inflation excluding food and energy. And in particular, when Fed policymakers, if you read the minutes of the FOMC meetings, Fed policymakers are very focused on the 12-month rate of change in the personal consumption expenditure deflator, less food and energy. And that variable still has, so filtering out food and energy reduces volatility substantially. But at the quarterly frequency, and especially the monthly frequency, there's still a lot of noise in that series. And even taking a 12-month average doesn't do as well as one might hope at filtering out the noise, as we'll see. Okay, so let me present this paper as a well-intentioned effort to make all of our lives easier, make it a little bit easier to explain inflation behavior and find a stable Phillips curve. Sandeep and I think that can be done if, as a measure of core inflation, we use the weighted median of inflation rates across industries. Now, and the basic reason behind this is pretty simple. Going back to taking out energy and taking out food that used to be more volatile, the idea was that these industries are very volatile, so if we take them out, we'll have a less volatile series that better captures the underlying trend in inflation. However, while energy is very volatile and food sometimes is very volatile, a number of other industries have pretty volatile prices. And if you look month by month or quarter by quarter, there are significant ups and downs in inflation, which, if you look at it closely, what might be going on is a price war in airline fares or markdowns in clothing. Actually, the clothing industry is quite volatile. Mark Watson talked a little bit about clothing and how it's difficult to interpret the prices because there are changes in the nature of goods. Actually, I suffer from the same problem that Mark does, that I don't go to Brooks Brothers frequently enough to really monitor all the innovations in clothing. But I think actually it's not just new products. I think also there are markups and markdowns and clearance sales that cause clothing prices to be quite volatile. And in some months, there are big changes in men's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing, which cause otherwise strange-looking movements in aggregate inflation, because some of these things like clothing are not huge, are big enough sectors in the economy that their price changes can have an effect on aggregate inflation. All right, so the idea behind, and I'll say this in a minute, the idea of median inflation goes back at least to research at the Cleveland Fed in the early 1990s and also research in the Dallas Fed. So this basic idea is by no means original. I think basically it's an idea that's been around for more than 20 years, but has not been exploited as much as it should have been, or is not. So I want to basically advertise this approach that's been around for a while. Now again, the point that other industries besides food and energy sometimes have big price changes has been recognized. And in fact, in this recent episode of about a year ago, when Janet Yellen was doing her best to explain what's going on in inflation, she pointed out at one point there's been a price. I think actually what happened was that unlimited data plans are introduced. And then and that was recorded as a massive quality adjustment, and so a massive decrease in the price of quality adjusted cell phone services. At one point, Janet Yellen mentioned prescription drug prices. At one point, she said, somewhat vaguely, there's a whole range of idiosyncratic factors in different industries. Now, in our view, it's pretty hard work at best to go sort of month by month and scanning the economy for what's happened to cell phones, what's happened to prescription drugs, that it's simpler and more systematic just to filter out whatever industry price changes are especially large by using a median or using a trimmed mean. Again, as some of you probably know, the Cleveland Fed has a median, the Dallas Fed has a trimmed mean. I'm quite agnostic, and either of those obviously takes out the big price changes. I think it's a subject for future research. What's exactly the best way to take out the biggest price changes? Is it a median or is it a trimmed mean? But that approach, I think, is less work and more systematic than making up stories month by month. Also less dangerous. One has to be very careful, I think, in explaining inflation movement, aggregate inflation movements by price changes in certain industries, because it's too easy to fix a problem with your model. I mean, anytime I have some equation that forecasts inflation and inflation is higher than forecast, I can say, oh, well, that's because medical prices have risen quickly this month. Or if it's lower than forecast, I can say, oh, that's because computer prices have fallen this month. There are always relative price changes, so you can always cherry pick price increases or price decreases to quote unquote explain why inflation is high or low. But I think just using the median is kind of a more impartial way to filter out unusual price changes. Okay, so I'm going to present some empirical work. Let me say, well, one more thing. It's interesting to compare what we're doing here to some other approaches to measuring core inflation. So again, there's the traditional approach of taking out food and energy. So there's the Stock and Watson approach, which is very interesting, of changing the weights on industries. So housing gets a big weight, some other things get weights, some things get zero weights. If I understood what Mark said about what's done here at the bank, there's the core measure where my understanding is certain industries are taken out. So the philosophy of all of those approaches is to figure out what industries are causing volatility and let's take them out. But of course, once you decide what industries you're taking out or what industries you're downweighting, then it's the same for every month. The philosophy of the weighted median or the trimmed mean is you take out different industries in different months, depending, it's whichever industries happen to have large price changes. And certain industries might often show up in the tails and be filtered out, but it's determined by what has big price changes in a given month, and it changes in different months. And I think those approaches are complementary. We can maybe discuss the pros and cons of those two approaches. Okay, so we look at the CPI and the PCE deflator in the US and compare the behavior of headline inflation, again, the traditional core measure in the US that takes out food and energy, and then weighted median inflation. And we use the weighted median series from the Cleveland Fed. We also construct a weighted median from data from the Dallas Fed. The Dallas Fed constructs a trimmed mean, just really for comparability to the Cleveland Fed median. We take the underlying industry data from the Dallas Fed and construct a weighted median of PCE, deflator, inflation. Again, in my mind, it's a very open question, whether we should have a median or a trimmed mean, or exactly how we should cut off the tail of large price increases. All right, so 3 findings. One very simple is just that the weighted median is a relatively stable measure of core inflation. But presumably one good property of core inflation is that it doesn't bounce around too much because of transitory shocks, and the weighted median does relatively well by that criterion. Actually, after point 1, I'm going to skip ahead to point 3 because that's obviously so related to the other papers of this conference that it's going to be easier to have a happy view of a healthy Phillips curve if we measure inflation with the weighted median. And then if I have time, I'll get back to the gory details of what happened in the US in the last 2 years. We have a little case study of that. Okay. So let me see, because I'm going to do some of the slides a little out of order, be sure I remember which one I want to get to. Yeah. Yeah, so again, first, very quickly, let's see. I hope this shows up okay. So here we did not, so this is monthly data for the CPI and the PCE deflator. We didn't bother in this graph to have headline inflation because that's incredibly volatile month to month. This is saying we're going to look at core inflation, but we're comparing core CPI, core as measured by taking out food and energy, and core is measured by median inflation. And I hope you can read this somewhat. The dark line is median, and the dashed or dotted line is leaving out food and energy. And month by month, there were bigger fluctuations in the traditional measure of core. The median is relatively stable and seems to stay closer to some underlying trend. So that's a very simple piece of evidence. And that is for monthly inflation. I won't go through this whole table, but we look at monthly, quarterly, and then also a 12-month average, again, for PCE and CPIX. And CPIX and PCEX means excluding food and energy. And to summarize this table, the standard deviation of core as measured by median inflation is about 2/3 as big as the standard deviation of core as measured by inflation excluding food and energy. And that's pretty consistent for different frequencies and for the CPI and the PCE. So you get a substantial step towards a more stable series. All right, so that's very quick. Let me move on. Again, there's been a big focus in this conference. For right now, ignore all the numbers in the tables. And most of you have better eyesight than I do, probably. Hope you can read just look at the equation at the top, because that's why I want to tell you what Phillips curve we're looking at. So we're looking at the simplest version of Milton Friedman's expectations augmented Phillips curve, that inflation minus expected inflation or forecasted inflation just depends on some gap between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. So unexpected inflation related to an unemployment gap, sort of, again, Milton Friedman's classic idea. And we measure these variables. We're not really trying, we're not trying at all to be at the frontier of Phillips curve specification. We measure these variables sort of in the most obvious ways we can think of. The inflation expectations variable or inflation forecast variable is just the 10-year forecast from the Survey of Professional Forecasters. Actually, one important point about that is, this is not news to a lot of you, but the behavior of inflation expectations, we're going to look in 1985 to the present. The behavior of inflation expectations in the US has changed quite a bit since 1985. In particular, it seems as though inflation expectations have become more anchored. And so if you have a reduced form Phillips curve with a lagged inflation term, so this came out clearly in Jordi Galli's paper and some of the other papers, it looks as though there's been a shift with the coefficient on lagged inflation going down. We sweep all that under the rug by just saying we're looking at inflation relative to expected inflation, and if the behavior of expected inflation is changing, that's reflected in our data, and we're going to argue that this equation is fairly stable. For the unemployment gap, again, we just do the first thing that comes into our heads, rightly or wrongly, which is to use the Hodrick-Prescott filter to take out a trend in unemployment, and then we get an unemployment gap. Now, let me actually show you graphs rather than, maybe I'll come back to the tables, but pictures are worth 1,000 words. Okay, so now again, for graphs, we don't even bother with headline inflation. So if you do go back and look at the table, look at the tables in the paper, almost always, if you have headline inflation in this simple Phillips curve with quarterly data, the unemployment coefficient is not significant. For our sample period. And if you do a scatter plot, it looks just like a cloud with no, so it's easy to see if you look at headline inflation that there doesn't seem to be a Phillips curve. So we focus on, we say we certainly need to look at core inflation. We focus on the comparison between, again, inflation less food and energy and median inflation. So this is for our entire sample period, 1985 to 2017, and the left is inflation excluding food and energy, and the right is median inflation. Now here the difference is actually not all that dramatic. If you look at it closely, there's a downward sloping Phillips curve in both cases. The relationship's somewhat tighter for median. If you look at the adjusted R-squareds in our little regressions, it's 0.22 with inflation excluding food and energy, and I forget 0.4 something with median CPI inflation. So you get a somewhat tighter Phillips curve with median inflation. But for the CPI, since 1985, it's not all that bad, even with the traditional measure of core inflation. The choice of core inflation measures makes a bigger difference with the PCE deflator, which again is the one that the Federal Reserve focuses on. So here on the left, you're getting something which is looking, maybe there's a Phillips curve, it's looking pretty noisy. There's much more evidence of a Phillips curve when you use median inflation over here. Where the difference really becomes noticeable is in the last 10 years. So again, many people would say, well, there might have been a Phillips curve before the Great Recession, but something happened and it either died or went on a long vacation, or we haven't seen it in the last 10 years. And that negative conclusion is easy to come to if you use inflation excluding food and energy, but not, you get a much better result if you use median. So this is for the CPI, again, just the subsample of the last 10 years. And on the left, you have the unemployment gap against pi minus pi f, with pi measured by inflation excluding food and energy. The right is, again, the weighted median, and we do better. And it's especially dramatic. So this is the PCE deflator data. So the left-hand side, again, the Fed focuses on PCE inflation excluding food and energy. So the graph on the left is in effect the graph that people at the Fed have been looking at for the last 10 years, and there doesn't seem to be any Phillips curve, whereas there still is. And of course, we have all the regression results. You still have quite a significant negative relationship if you use the weighted median, so it makes a big difference. Okay. All right, so I have 9 minutes and 20 seconds left, so let me spend some time going back and talking about the other part of the paper, we do a pretty in-depth analysis of the last 18 months or so of U.S. inflation history, which again, some people have viewed as especially puzzling. So I'm not sure how dramatically this shows up in the graphs, but on the left-hand side, the lower line here, the dashed line, this is the variable that the Fed focuses on. So it is, again, the 12-month rate of change in PCE inflation excluding food and energy. And again, this is what puzzled Janet Yellen. It was close to 2% at the beginning of 2017. It got down to 1.3%, rebounded to 1.5% at the end of 2017. And so this was why there was puzzling. Why is core inflation going down when the economy is recovering? This above is median CPI, median PCE deflator inflation. As one footnote, one feature of the data which other people have noted, and I think other people and we also do not fully understand, is that for the PCE deflator, there's actually a systematic difference in the mean level or average level. That it's typical that median is somewhat higher than the traditional measure of core. That's not true for CPI. CPI excluding food and energy and CPI, median CPI have very similar average levels. There's something very subtle about, it must be asymmetries in the PCE distribution that don't show up in the CPI distribution, which we haven't gotten our heads around yet. But anyway, so try to ignore for now the gaps in levels. And I think it's fair to say if the Fed had been looking not at this line, but at this line, this goes down a little bit, but then comes back at the end of 2017, which is right around here. I think it's exactly or within 1/10 of a point of the beginning of 2017. So you would not have seen a puzzling fall in inflation. Now again, these are 12-month averages, and it's possible, of course, to look at the underlying monthly changes. And that's what we have here. And again, other people have pointed this out. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at the data. There was this big shock in March. So March 2017, there was by the Fed's preferred measure of PCE excluding food and energy, there was an annualized inflation rate of minus 1.8%. And that's a pretty big blip. Minus 1.8% is almost 4 percentage points below the 2% target. Now, it's just for 1 month, but 1 month out of 12, missing by 4 percentage points in 1 month is enough to knock off about half of a percentage point on the 12-month average. So, so basically, a lot of this period of the 12-month rate being low had to do with the fact that the 12-month period included this March outlier. There are also these dips. I think this is May, this is November. Again, we don't have that kind of as much volatility. The dark line here is median, and at the monthly level, as I've argued before, median PCE inflation does not have these big outliers. By the way, there was also, if you look at, so everybody knows that monthly inflation is volatile. The Fed tries to smooth some of that out by looking at 12-month changes. But that's not fully successful, partly because, again, one outlier month can have a substantial effect on the 12-month average. Also, there was an incident right here. This is March 2018. There was an uptick in inflation in March 2018. I've actually looked at the FOMC minutes, and people talk about, oh, there's been an uptick in inflation, and why is that? Maybe something's happened to some industries. Is this going to continue and inflation is going to overheat, or is this transitory? What actually happened, and actually a number of commentators have noticed this, pointed this out, but I think if I read the FOMC minutes correctly, FOMC members missed that. Basically, the big event in March 2018 was that the March 2017 observation dropped out of the 12-month average. And so that mechanically meant the 12-month average went up. So again, because of the volatility in PCE excluding food and energy, you can easily confuse yourself about how it's behaving, even if you look at the 12-month average. Now, to look, and this is maybe the last slide, which is good as I run out of time. So this is March 2017. And we have here just a histogram of changes in industry price changes from the PCE. And I'm not sure, I cannot read the numbers here. Maybe some of you can. It's in the paper, but you can get the picture of basically left skewness. There were some industries with, I think this is negative 65 or 70% or something. And again, we list the industries down here. Actually, Janet Yellen gave a speech in which she emphasized the dramatic drop in cell phone prices. And I think actually cell phone prices are in here somewhere. I think cell phones are part of the communication sector, and cell phone prices dropped so much that annualized the communications industry had, I think, a negative 40% inflation rate. And that's a big enough sector to materially affect the average inflation rate. But as Janet Yellen put it, there's a whole range of idiosyncratic factors. This left tail, and as far as I know, there wasn't anything really systematic happening, just a number of industries. If you look at different months, they're all different sorts of distributions, sometimes symmetric, sometimes right skewed, sometimes left skewed. This just happened to be a month where there were a lot of big price decreases. And again, what the Fed does or what Janet Yellen was doing in 2017 was going through and talking about cell phone prices, talking about pharmaceutical prices, talking about other prices. And again, that's at best hard work, and at worst can be misleading because you can always, actually pharmaceutical prices they went down, they didn't go down that much. They weren't actually in the tail. So it just is a lot, if you're going to think about how industry price changes distort measures of aggregate inflation, it seems relatively clean and easy to just filter things out by using a weighted median. And I think I finished pretty much on time. Thank you very much.